Hello everyone and welcome to the Australian Physiotherapy Association's 2021 Continuous Professional Development Seminar. Today's seminar is based around providing and improving culturally appropriate and safe care for Indigenous Australians in the physiotherapist workplace setting. The Physiotherapist Board of Australia's Continuing Professional Development Registration Standard requires all practicing physiotherapists attend at least 20 hours of CPD per year. By completing this seminar, you'll be able to document one completed hour of CPD into your portfolio. So the learning outcomes today include examining the invention of racial sciences, its associations with colonial domination, and the impact on Australian society today, viewing the impact of social determinants of health for Indigenous Australians, and exploring First Nation people's perspectives on health and well-being. In examining the invention of racial sciences, first we must look at some key word definitions based around this concept. We have race, ethnicity, prejudice, stereotyping, discrimination, and racial discrimination. So what is racial science? In historical European times, the term race was used to describe specific groups on the basis of biological characteristics, usually based on external features such as eye or skin color or facial hair. The ideology of racial sciences became legitimized during the early 19th century due to prominent scientists such as Samuel George Morton, who justified racism through the study of differences in the size and shape of human skulls from around the world. Believing there were multiple racial creations, he hypothesized that human skull size was directly associated with intelligence, concluding that Europeans were superior to Indigenous Australians. This theory, along with others such as the Great Chain of Being and social Darwinism, gave racism a legitimate scientific reasoning. So racism is born of the idea or belief that each identifiable grouping of humans possesses specific cultural or individual characteristics and abilities which distinguish it. Now, biological notions of race have now been shown to be baseless, with genetic research establishing that there is only one race, the human race. The supposed inferiority or superiority of one racial group over another is no longer a viable or accepted theory. In contemporary times, the term race is more commonly used as a social construction of particular groups, often in terms of presumed superiority or inferiority. If we are to come to understand what colonial domination is, first we must look at some keyword definitions based around this concept. That includes colonization, colonialism, and social exclusion. Today, the historical connotations of colonization include a range of practices: war, displacement, forced labor, removal of children, relocation, ecological destruction, massacres, genocide, slavery, unintentional spread of deadly diseases, banning of indigenous languages, regulation of marriage, assimilation and eradication of social, cultural, and spiritual practices. So how is racial sciences associated to colonial domination? Europeans used various racial scientific theories, such as Morton's, to claim superiority over Indigenous cultures and communities to justify the colonization of Australia and colonial domination of Indigenous Australians. This not only happened to Indigenous Australians, but also the Maori native to New Zealand, the Inuit native to Canada, and the First Nations people of the Americas. Through the use of racial sciences, colonization, and colonial domination, Indigenous Australians were dispossessed from native title, thereby disrupting cultural practices and traditional knowledge linked to the land. Racial sciences was also used to shape historical government policies of segregation, protectionism, assimilation, and integration through social exclusion, relegating Indigenous Australians to outsider status. If we are to look at how racial science has influenced the institutions and systems which structure society, first we must define some key concepts. Individual racism occurs when individuals or small groups support the precepts and maintenance of racist division, whereas institutional racism is the imposition of laws and regulations, as well as attitudes which discriminate against ethnic groups and provide support and justification to individual racism. Deficit discourse is an attitude that frames Indigenous Australians negatively with a narrative of deficiency and failure. Historically, through the use of racial sciences, the Europeans developed prejudices and stereotypes based on the ethnicity of Indigenous cultures, which instilled discrimination and racism at the institutional level through various areas of government policies, which in turn intensified individual racism. In contemporary times, the ideology of deficit discourse is seen as a direct result of the historical influences of racial sciences. A relevant healthcare example is the 2005 Closing the Gap target, which is focus dominated by statistical deficits of inequality faced by Indigenous Australians, instead of examining the complex historical, structural, social, and cultural aspects behind the data that drive these differences. These social determinants of health are the fundamental structures of social hierarchy and the social, economic, and politically determined conditions that result in either good health, ill health, or disease, in which people grow, live, work, and age. The social determinants of health are primarily viewed from a traditional European perspective. For Indigenous Australians, the social determinants of health are based on values and connection to country. From this perspective, an individual who lives through the key values of respect, reciprocity, caring, compassion, and relationships could be considered healthy, even if lacking the Western concepts of determinants such as education, employment, or housing. Higher levels of education are linked to satisfying employment, stable housing, healthy relationships, and higher health literacy through informed decisions about healthy food and lifestyle choices. Lower levels are linked with poor health, lower health literacy, higher stress, and lower self-confidence. During 2018 to 2019, around 90% of non-Indigenous Australians aged 20 to 24 had attained Year 12 or equivalent, compared to around 66% for Indigenous Australians of the same age. Indigenous Australians' view of education acknowledges much more than the traditional Western viewpoint, taking into account social and cultural education through connection to country and social relationships. Historically, government policies built upon racial sciences allowed for the exclusion of Indigenous Australians from the educational system due to ethnicity. Employment generates income needed for secure housing, education, food, goods, and services needed for daily living and good health outcomes. In 2018 to 2019, an estimated 60% of Indigenous Australians aged 15 to 64 were participating in the labour force, and 49% were employed. For non-Indigenous Australians, 80% of the working age population was in the labour force and 76% were employed. The median equivalized gross weekly household income of Indigenous adults was $542, compared with $852 for non-Indigenous adults during 2014 to 2015. The impact of the lower employment and lower income rates are a major determinant of ill health for Indigenous Australians. Housing is one of the most important determinants of health, affecting education, social, and economic opportunities. The quality of housing, the cleanliness of the environment, safe, clean drinking water, air free from pollution, rubbish disposal services, levels of crime, safety of roads, provisions of parks, playgrounds, and footpaths to get there, distances from affordable food, and access to services are all related to where you live. Indigenous Australians are more likely to live in an overcrowded house, with around 21% of Indigenous Australians living in overcrowded conditions compared to 6% of non-Indigenous Australians during 2014 to 2015. Overcrowded housing is a known determinant of poorer health outcomes due to the increased risk of skin, bacterial, or viral infections. Through the Indigenous Australians' viewpoint of determinants of health, sharing housing with additional family or friends may be considered a way of demonstrating respect, reciprocity, kindness, compassion, caring, and relationships. Social exclusion is a form of impoverishment where people are relegated to the margins of community and social life due to different social, political, and economic constraints. A major determinant on the standards of health and also linked to rates of premature death. Social exclusion can operate on the institutional level in relation to equal employment opportunity, affordable education, and cultural or social majority, or it can operate on the individual level through income disparities, occupational status, and social networks based around race, gender, and religion to exclude people. Racial discrimination can occur through social exclusion due to the invention of racial sciences, the colonization of Australia, and colonial domination of First Nation people. Institutional racism has historically embedded in government policies which marginalise Indigenous Australians through social exclusion. With far-reaching consequences, many of the single determinants of health are interdependent, which impacts on the health of Indigenous Australians. In this slide, you can see the map on the left is the European perspective of Australia, commonly recognised today after colonisation, and the map on the right is the First Nation people's perspective of Australia before colonisation. The AIAT-SIS map of Australia shows different identities of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples based upon clans, dialects, or individual languages. This map represents how diverse and multicultural Indigenous Australians are, with each group having a unique language, law, customs, culture, and history in connection to country. The First Nation people's concept of health encompasses the physical, mental, and spiritual health of not only the individual, but the interrelations between the individual inside the community. This holistic approach is interdependent on the environmental, spiritual, ideological, political, social, economic, mental, and physical factors that can result in ill health if just one of these factors are unbalanced. This is uniquely different from the European definition of health, which is attributed predominantly from the biomedical model of healthcare. The World Health Organization defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. If we are to integrate our knowledge on the Indigenous Australian perspectives on health and well-being into the Australian healthcare practice, we can look to Ramsden's framework for practicing cultural safety. Ramsden describes cultural awareness as a beginning step to recognize that there is a cultural difference. Cultural sensitivity begins a process of self-exploration as the realization that one's own reality and life experience may have an effect on others due to the legitimacy of difference. And cultural safety is a desired outcome in healthcare that allows culturally safe service to be defined by those who receive this service. We must also define the concept of decolonisation, which is the process of ending colonisation and challenging its continuing effects to allow self-determination for Indigenous peoples. It involves appreciating the value of traditional practices and reclaiming them when appropriate. As an allied health professional, first we must approach a sense of cultural awareness by recognising that many beliefs, values, and attitudes that are formed about Indigenous Australians in early childhood from mechanisms such as family, class, ethnicity, religion, schooling, and social media can be misconceptualised. If we do not practice cultural sensitivity to understand the rich cultural diversity of Indigenous Australians' perspectives, experiences, and knowledge, a serious imbalance of power can occur when one group uses its position to impose its own values upon another, threatening the identity and security of the other cultural group. By practicing cultural safety in the workplace, we can undertake a process of decolonisation by reflecting on the colonial history and recognising the impacts on Indigenous Australians today to provide culturally appropriate and safe care. As physiotherapists, our approach to healthcare is based around the comprehensive primary healthcare model. This addresses the issues of social justice and equity through multidisciplinary services that are co-located and connects patients with local community organisations and advocacy movements to address the underlying social, economic, and political causes of poor health. Through this, we follow the biopsychosocial model, which views healthcare as more than just a biomedical approach, encompassing psychological and social factors such as patients' emotions, thoughts, motivations, experiences, family, social connections, and culture. As practicing physiotherapists and members of the allied health profession, our principles are based around comprehensive primary healthcare delivered through the biopsychosocial model. This holistic approach views health as positive well-being, directly linked to all the determinants of health. This approach aims to raise health standards through collaboration, community participation, cultural competence, education, and empowerment of patients by supporting people to live. By practicing Ramsden's framework for cultural safety, self-reflection of First Nation people's perspectives, experiences, and culture, and working under the principles of the biopsychosocial model, you can achieve cultural competence in the workplace through providing culturally safe and appropriate care as a physiotherapist.